Hey, this is Dave from DK Studios, and today we're comparing the Accsoon Toprig line of motorized sliders with my Edelkrone, SliderPLUS, and for bonus marks, we're also going to compare it to my Magic Carpet Pro from Syrp. Now, the spoiler first, the Accsoon Toprig S40 and S60 motorized sliders are the most travel-friendly, fastest to set up, and most convenient and best value sliders I've ever used, punching well above their asking price. With the exception of repeatable macro shots or full manual control, they outshine even the more expensive competition. Before we go on, full disclosure, I purchased the S40 with my own money and was so impressed I made a quick user guide and review with a link that I'll put in the description. I then reached out to Accsoon and they were kind enough to send me the S60 without charge, but without strings attached too. So as always, I'll be sharing my honest thoughts, good and bad, giving you the details so you can make your own informed decision. And as always, you'll find links and updates as well as a clickable index in the description below. So why, Dave, would you ever want a motorized slider? At any price point, motorized sliders are seemingly the holy grail of shots that are difficult, even with a gimbal. From detailed macro product shots to adding visual interest to interview talking heads, motorized sliders can help achieve professional results. But the problem with most automated sliders is that they are cumbersome to transport, set up, and use. So I often find myself leaving them at home instead of bringing them with me, until I found the Accsoon Toprig sliders. So who could really benefit from these guys? Anybody who does product videos, anybody who does corporate, commercial, or documentary films. I also find that they're great for photographers who want to do time lapses. Now, why should you trust me? Don't tell my wife, but I've tested and still own more sliders than anyone could reasonably justify. From Conovo, GVM, Edelkrone, Syrp, and now Accsoon. I've been on the quest for the perfect slider, and though none are perfect in every regard, the Accsoon is so impressive it is the only one I currently recommend to 99.9% use cases. On to the review. Build quality is excellent. The entire chassis is metal with a rubber gear drive that produces super smooth movements. There's thoughtful design elements like an included bubble level, and the 4 rubber feet can be adjusted for slightly even terrain. The central base of both the S40 and 60 have multiple mounting points, a central 3/8 inch as well as 4 1/4 inches around. The S60 has an additional 1/4 inch 20 with RE locating pins at either end as well as on either side, making vertical mounting very simple. The battery sled and control box are plastic. It's not the thickest or best plastic I've ever used, but it does the job. The buttons are rubberized with a good tactile feel. Again, not the best buttons I've ever pressed, but again, they get the job done. The dial feels fantastic, and that's how we control the speed. And you've also got 4 LEDs that show you how much power you have left on your little battery. There's 3 ports on the side. There's the DC in that takes 7.4 to 16.8 volts. There's also a 5-volt output to add some juice to your camera while you're doing a long time lapse, for example. And there's also a 2.5-inch cable to control your camera for time lapses. Thoughtful attention to detail includes a rubberized tripod head mount with a 3/8 inch screw that is spring-loaded, revealing a 1/4 inch 20 nut. Let's talk about some of the pros of the Toprig sliders. They're both extremely travel friendly. They're compact and they're lightweight. They're super fast to set up. We'll go through that in a minute. And they're very intuitive. I have never cracked open the manual. I also love the fact that it doesn't require an app to control or set AB points or the speed. I can't overstate how great this is to just be able to turn it on, calibrate it, and just start shooting. It saves so much time in setup that I've actually used it on commercial shoots versus leaving it behind. The smartphone app is also very intuitive. If you want to do time lapses, that's the only way that you can program your time lapses. And I didn't even crack over the manual for that. And I'm not a time lapse expert. It was just very easy to do. I also like that these are kind of the Goldilocks lengths. The S40 gives you 40 centimeters of travel, which is long enough for product and food shots. And if you want slightly more distance from your subject and more parallax, then the S60 is perfect for interviews and push-ins for commercial shoots. The engineers have also created a system that sips batteries. So even with the smallest MPF battery, I can control my slider for hours. Setting up the Toprig is super simple. Get your tripod head on, plug in a battery. I recommend using the smallest battery so that it doesn't obstruct the tripod head. Turn it on and then press play. It'll auto-calibrate from left to right to see if there's any obstructions. And once it does that once, just hit play. If you want to loop it continuously, hit the loop button. You can change your speed with the dial and you're golden. You can also program A/B points very simply. You can just hit A at one point, hit B for the second point, press play. And again, if you want to loop it continuously, hit loop before it hits the last point, and it'll continuously loop forever. A second way of setting A and B points is manually. You can physically move the head to your A point, press the A, physically move it to the B point, then press the A/B point again, press play, and again, you can loop forever. And the speed control is super intuitive and easy. You can just go super slow. I can hardly see that moving. Or the fast is actually pretty darn fast. I should note that anytime you change the speed via the dial, the first end point will be abrupt. So if I change this right now to faster, watch the first end. It's a bit abrupt. Everything else eases in and out perfectly. But the first change is going to be a little bit abrupt right there. And then after that, it's nice and smooth. I wish it weren't the case, but it's just one of those quirks that you have to consider. If you wanted to pan the head centrally, just loosen the two knobs of the central bar and then move it to one section as much as you want, and you'll notice that it'll pan toward the center. If you want to go panorama, pan outwards on either end, go to the other end. And of course, there's limitations to this because of the length of the bar, but it does the job for some things. Let's get to some of the cons. The motor is great and strong, and it can definitely hold its capacity of 4 kilograms without a problem, even at an angle. But when you do stop the motor, I find that it creeps and slowly slips down if you don't have the motor engaged. Once you turn the motor back on, no problem. It'll just keep on moving back and forth at whatever speed you want. So what I do, I end up leaving it running continuously to prevent my camera from slipping. On my wish list, perhaps if they added a locking base so that it doesn't slip when you want to transport it or when it's on an angle, that would be great. Another thing to note is that you can't really manually push this. Although you could, you can kind of feel the gears of the belt as you push it along. It's not really meant for manual control. And a small quirk with the control knob is whenever you change the speed, even if you're going on continuous loop from A to B points, the first stop at the end point will be an abrupt stop. Thereafter, everything is nice and smooth with the ease in and out, but the first stop is going to be a bit abrupt. Also of note, when you're using the app for the Toprig sliders, you can't control the speed of the slide with the app. You have to use the manual knob. Not a big deal. And while I love the simplicity of changing the pan via the two knobs on either end, it isn't as accurate or flexible as having a motorized panning head like the Edelkrone. But for simple things like product shots and talking heads, it's good enough for most things. Now let's compare the Accsoon Toprig to the Edelkrone slider. One thing that I should note is that the Edelkrone slider is more accurate if you're doing macro videos or if you want to do multiple passes with people appearing, disappearing on the track. This is going to be the most accurate system. The problem I find with the Edelkrone is that it requires an app, and I do have the remote, but the app is a little bit more powerful and faster to set up, honestly. But every time I have to use an app, I'm controlling everything else with an app too. And so my lights are now on an app. I have 3 brands of lights, Godox, Aperture, as well as Intellitek, and every single one of them have a different app to control lights. And then I've got to open up this app. And why isn't this moving right now? It's because when I turned all these on, it required a firmware update. That is so annoying if you're on the job and you haven't used it for a couple weeks. You turn it on and say, oh, firmware update required. And you're just hoping that the firmware takes and that your client isn't looking over your shoulder, wondering why you're stalling and not getting any shots done. So more often than not, I find myself leaving this at home. If I'm doing studio work that requires really accurate work in the studio, then yeah, I'll use this on my own time. But if a client is watching me work, it's just too unreliable for me to trust that this system is going to work every time. If you're comparing setup and speed of use, Toprig wins by a landslide. Each of Edelkrone's modules require a different kind of battery. So I've got an MPF battery on the slider motor, and I've got a Canon battery on the panning head. And it just gets more and more complicated the more and more modular you go. And although the Edelkrone is way more modular as far as growing the system, it's also a pain in the butt to set up and pair. And just for giggles, let's take a look at the Syrp Magic Carpet Pro. I don't have a motorized version, but you can buy a motor and get this all set up and rigged to motorize. But the beauty of this is that it's got an integrated flywheel inside the base of this. So it's really smooth for manual slides. The other benefit of this particular system is that it's modular. This is a 3-foot section, but you can also buy additional 3-foot or 2-foot sections and continuously build it out to have an infinitely long track. It's super smooth, super great if you're doing tutorials and you need super long takes without having to stop in the middle of a track. So I love the system for manual pulls, but really it's not a really fair comparison at its different price point and for its different use case. Between the S40 and S60, which one should you choose? It really depends on what you shoot. If you do product or food videos, then the S40 might be enough for you. And the nice thing about it is that it's small enough to fit in a backpack. The S60 though is a little bit longer, and what's great about it is that it's long enough to do a little bit more of a push-in for commercial work, as well as talking heads. It has a nice smooth motion for talking heads as a B camera. So the best basic motorized slider is going to go to the Accsoon Toprig series. They're just super easy, fast, reliable, smooth, and they have a very simple but effective pan control. And then the best manual control slider is going to be the Syrp Magic Carpet Pro. So the bottom line, the Accsoon Toprig S40 and S60 are the lightest, most compact, fastest to set up, and easiest to use motorized sliders I've ever used. With the exception of ultra accurate repeatable macro shots or manual control, these motorized sliders hit well above their asking price, and I highly, highly recommend them both. That wraps up this review, but before I let you go, I do have a thought of the day. And the thought of the day is this: don't be selfish, don't try to impress others. Be humble. Think of others better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or if I've missed anything, hit me up in the comments below. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.